statements. Next, we're going to move on to talking about arrays. An array is just a list of items. The way you declare it is using brackets. So we can say const names equals Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Right? So now we have our array with 3 items in it. Arrays in JavaScript do not have to have their size defined beforehand, so you could continue appending data to this for as long as you want, and you don't have to worry about it, running out of memory space or anything like that. Arrays are 0 indexed, much like most other languages. So if we want to get Alice, what we could do is we could console.log names, and then to index within the array, we use brackets again and do the position we want to index. So 0 would be Alice, 1 would be Bob, 2 would be Charlie. Another important thing is if you want to get the last element in an array, you can use a built-in function within, or a built-in value within an array, which is just the length of the array. So to get the last item, it's always going to be the length of the array, which in this case is names dot length, and then subtract 1 so that you don't go out of bounds. So if we go bun arrays.js, you'll get Charlie. One of the most common things that you have to do with an array is you have to loop through all of the items. There's a couple ways you can approach this, and it honestly just comes down to personal preference. First thing is you can loop through the indexes. So you can say for let index equal 0 while the index is less than names.length, and then increment the index by saying index plus equals 1. And then you could console.log names index, like so, if you wanted to log all of the names. Alice, Bob, Charlie. You can also access the items directly if you don't care about the index. For that, we would say for const name of names, and then we could console.log name, like so, get us the same thing. Or very often we want both. In that case, there's a special function we can call on an array called array.entries, and that's going to basically give us both the index and the item itself, so that we don't have to worry about indexing within the array. So for that, you just say const index item of names.entries, and then we could log the index and then the item, like so. Run that, and as you can see, we have index item, index item, index item. Again, personal preference. Now moving on to specific array methods, also known as functions, two in the same, both of those words mean the same thing. Two most basic things you can check is, first, does an array have some value, which will return either true or false. So we could say const has Aiden equals names dot contains, dot includes Aiden. This is going to return false because our names array does not have Aiden. You can also search for the specific index at which some value exists. If you have duplicates, so for example, we had 2 Alices, then it will find the first occurrence, but we could say const Alice position equals names dot index of Alice. And this will return 0 because the first occurrence of Alice, oops, if I lowercased it, then it would. This will return 0 because that's the first occurrence. If there are no occurrences, so for example, I did some kind of misspelling, Alice, ASDF, this would return -1, which just implies that it doesn't exist. And yeah. Next off are a lot of functions that you can call an array, which essentially make the process of looping through an array easier. So everything we cover in the next 5 minutes, if you don't really understand it, you can always just loop through an array. First thing we can do is you can filter out items within an array and just get a subset of items. So if you could imagine doing this with a for loop, let's say we wanted to get only the names that are longer than 4 letters. Sorry, Bob. So what we could do is we could say const long names is an empty array, and then we could loop through for const name of names, have our condition say if name.length is greater than 4, then we would add the name to our long names array. We could say long names dot push to add something, the actual name. And here we could console.log long names. And then if we run that, we can comment that out. Oops. Then we get only the long names. However, this syntax is not the best. It's kind of long, kind of verbose, and we can do much, much better. For that, we use the filter function. So we could say const long names filter equals names dot filter. And within the filter function, we have to say how do we want to filter these values. What we're going to do is we're going to pass a function that takes in the value itself and then returns true if we want to include it, or false if we do not want to include it. So we can say value arrow, and then we want to include it only if value.length is greater than 4. And we can try logging this. Console.log long names filter. And it works much the same. Now what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that this is an arrow function. What we're doing here is we are passing a function into another function. And that's why it's nice to just be able to use this super short, super concise syntax. We could, however, do something different. We could take this very short, concise inline arrow function and write a whole function that we would pass in to the filter function. We could say we'll use the old function filter, we'll call it filter function. We notice that we are taking in a value, so we'll say value, and then we want to return this expression. So we could say return value.length is greater than 4. Then instead of passing in this anonymous function, it's called an anonymous function just because it doesn't have a name. It only exists in this one place. We could pass in our filter function. and it'll work the exact same way. However, as you can see, this is extremely cumbersome and just ugly to look at. Realistically, we're only going to use this filtering within this one spot, and so therefore this inline syntax is almost always preferred and what you want to go with. Also, with all array functions like filter and more ones that we're going to cover, you can not only get the value of the specific item that you are looking at, but you can also get the index that we're looking at and the array itself. So, for instance, if the condition of whether or not we want to include the filtered array depended also on the index, or we needed to check some other values within the array, we can use this whole, all of that context to determine, whether or not we're gonna, at the end of the day, return true or false right there. The next most common one is the map function. The map function, it is gonna return an array that is the same length as your input array, whereas filter is going to be either the same length or shorter. However, it's going to transform the data. So for instance, let's say that, our names, we wanted to include the index within the name such that we could print it very nicely. We could say const names with index equals names dot map, and here we're going to need both the value and the index, so we can get the value, index, arrow syntax, and what we're going to return is a string where we're going to say index colon value. So this transforms the data. It's also important to note that here we're just working with strings, but you can return whatever data type you want here. You don't have to map a string to a string. You could map a string to some other complex object, to a number, to whatever you want. So let's just show this off. Console.log names with index. And we can run that. So there we go. So now we have this string where we have the index and the value. There's several more of these, but there's only 2 more we're going to cover today because many of them are not actually that useful. The next one is the .every function, and then also the .sum function. Basically, both of them, you pass in a condition, and .every checks whether or not that condition is true for every single element within the array, and .sum checks that that condition is true for at least one element within the array. And then both of them, depending on whether every element or only one of the elements pass the condition, will evaluate to either true or false. So what we could do is we could say all names long, and we would check if every name, or we'll just say current name, if every current name has a length of greater than 4. This is going to return false because we have Bob, which has a length of 3. But if we didn't want to check if all the names are long, we just wanted to say some of the names are long, then we could change this to .sum, and this will return